Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Dr. Garais, and I'm having trouble finding my lecture. There you go. Okay, fast forward to that part. I'm a little bit on the tired side, but I'm going to pick it up. Promise. Let's pick it up because this is NeuroAnatomy. This is Bio 112. I'm your host, Dr. Garais, Chapter 10. Let's look at the overview of the nervous system. And we already know we have to have some sensory input. That's our ascending fibers and our receptors. Integration and processing, that's our brain. It's got to make decisions. And making decisions usually falls under the frontal part of your brain. Motor output, of course, descending fibers or your effector pathways. Right? And we need the muscles and the glands to do stuff. And we know that the function of the nervous system is a communication system that will help maintain homeostasis. Now, the cool thing, the cool thing about the nervous system that it's almost instantaneous. It's in milliseconds instead of seconds to minutes to hours. And the star of the show are neurons. We already talked about that in tissues. And that's the nerve cell, okay? And the neuroglia, that's the support staff. So if I ask you, who protects the nervous system? Who supports, insulates, nourishes neurons, feeds the neuron? It goes, cleans its butt. Well, that's neuroglia. That's your glial cells. And your neurons, their only function is to do what? Send out the signal or transmit the signal. We already know this part. This looks really familiar, right? You have to have some sort of sensory receptor, for example. And I mentioned in previous lectures that when you see something, you use your eyes. You're not seeing the room or you're seeing your friend. Your eye is a organ, and it has these receptors in it that picks up light and light waves and light energy. And what the receptor does, it translates that light energy into an action potential or an electrical impulse that goes up the ascending pathway, the sensory pathway, to your brain. It is only your brain that like translates and also like sorts everything. So, you know, when they say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, it's subject to opinion, it's subject to emotion, you know, because your brain has to process what you're seeing. And then, of course, the effector, right? Because if you like what you see, you're going to, or attracted to what you see, your motor input would be to walk towards it. Or if you don't like what you see or you're frightened of what you see, your motor output will then do what? Get you out of there, okay? So the integration, of course, is your brain and spinal cord. But the whole entire time, the sensory input has to send wires up the spinal cord to the ascending fibers, also known as your sensory fibers, and something has to be done about whatever the brain was figuring out to maintain homeostasis, right? Or to protect you from things. And that's your effector, descending fibers, or your motor fibers. Now, the nervous system has separate nervous systems or separate ways to organize it. One way is your CNS, or your central nervous system. That is composed of solely your brain and your spinal cord. So if I ask you, what's in the central nervous system? It's your brain and spinal cord. That's it. Peripheral nervous system is everything else, okay? So that's your cranial nerves, spinal nerves, and we're going to talk more about that, and I believe you guys did an assignment and or homework regarding the cranial nerves and what they do for us. That is part of your peripheral nervous system, or your PNS. There's also subdivisions, of course, of your PNS, and we already discussed that. Sensory is afferent, ascending fibers, and efferent is your motor fibers. And another way to remember your motor or descending fibers is efferent effects the change in the homeostasis, or it is E for exiting the brain. All right, and if you exited the brain, you're going, you know, your pathway is going descending, and that's your motor pathway. Okay. I mentioned receptors. They convert whatever they pick up. So they change, like your eyes pick up light waves or light energy. Your ears pick up sound waves, right? And then they convert it into action potentials, which the brain can understand. Okay. Now, there's two subdivisions of your motor division, and they are your somatic and your autonomic. Somatic, of course, we already know that term, ic pertaining to, soma, your body. So those are voluntary commands to your skeletal muscles. That's your somatic. Your autonomic are involuntary. So let's talk about, hopefully they'll talk about autonomic in a minute. So you have your central nervous system here, and then your peripheral nervous system here, and the motor is even broken down to somatic and autonomic. Now your autonomic is smooth muscle and cardiac muscle. So think visceral, think cardiac and glands, stuff that you don't have direct control over. Here's another nice picture of your central nervous system, brain and spinal cord. Everything else, right, like your spinal nerves and your cranial nerves are in your peripheral nervous system. Neurons, what do they look like? We can look at these words, but they're going to probably show us a picture in a minute, and that's what this is. I hope you guys can see it. It's kind of small. But what parts of the neuron did you need to know? And maybe you could enhance it when you're looking at the PowerPoint for Chapter 10. Let's see. First, of course, it has your nucleus. And remember, we talked about dendrites. Dendrites pick up the signal, okay? And this is your cell body, also known as your soma. And it then translates all that electrical activity through this wire, okay? And this wire is called your axon. And then it goes ends into your synaptic bulb or your axon terminal. Synaptic knob, synaptic bulb, axon terminal. That's what this thing is on the end. And we already saw this when we were talking about neurotransmitters like acetylcholine and norepinephrine when we talked about muscles. And this is called a motor neuron if it's attached to a muscle. Now you'll notice a bunch of fat here. This is like fat hot dog buns. Now the electrical impulse has to go through this axon, this big wire, fast. And the best way to do that is to insulate this this axon or this wire. And the way we insulate it with fat. That fat is called, where is it? Myelin, right here. So that's your myelin sheath. And you'll notice that there's spaces here. And the spaces are called nodes of Ranvier. So the fat is the fat insulation is called myelin, and the little spaces in between are the nodes of Ranvier. And you know, when something's insulated, the electrical part doesn't have to travel over it. So what can the electricity do? Instead of, you know, relatively slowly traveling through this wire like this, it can do what? Jump. It can go boop, 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 boop. Much faster than doing what? Going down here, then I got to go through here, going through here. So that's what the myelin, or that piece of hot dog adipose tissue, does for our axon, does for our neuron. It makes the impulse go in a certain direction. That's number one. And it's called saltatory conduction. And saltatory conduction makes the action potential or the electrical signal go much faster because it can jump from node of Ranvier to node of Ranvier like this. Boop, 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 bang. I'm already at the end. Instead of slowly, slowly, steadily, steadily traveling through here. So you could see if you have a demyelination disease that removes this, what's going to happen to your nervous impulses? What's going to happen to your action potential? It's going to go too slow, and that's not a good thing. Okay? Now, remember what we talked about neurons on the last lecture. This gets cut, or this gets demyelinated. Will you ever grow anything back? This will grow back and repair itself to an extent, but it will never grow back. That's why this weekend, it's Memorial Weekend, drink responsibly, try not to get hammered. And also, we're medical professionals. If you got hammered when you were a kid, that's got to stop. Okay? That's my little don't do drugs commercial. Okay? And you could see the myelin sheath, how it's like insulation. Can I make this bigger? No, I can't. So you can just make it bigger while you're watching at home. So, myelin sheath. That, the myelin, or that fat hot dog insulation that we just saw, is produced by these things called Schwann cells. Now, those Schwann cells are only in the peripheral nervous system. They get produced by these other sets of cells in the central nervous system, in your brain and spinal cord, called oligodendrocytes. Okay? And that's what also gives, the myelination, the fat. That's why your brain, there's going to be white matter, and there's also going to be gray matter. And the white matter is composed of a lot of fat. And so again, Schwann cells, peripheral nervous system. Oligodendrocytes, central nervous system. These two cells make myelin. And myelin is the insulation that covers the axon, or the main wire of your neuron, also known as your nerve cell. Okay? Multipolar, bipolar, unipolar neurons. Nice to know. Multipolar, it just means multipoles, multiple directions. Bipolar, it has one direction, one dendrite, one axon, right? So it's like, So let's see, here's some classic examples, right? So just know that multipolar means like it contains a whole bunch of signals, and the direction of the, and also, by the way, the direction of an impulse is always straight. So the electricity only goes one way. It never goes back. This is nice to know. Other more important things to know. We already know afferent versus efferent. We already know that. And we also know that the central nervous system is what? That's the control center. That's the thing that processes everything. That's the thing that interprets everything. Sensory doesn't interpret anything. Motor doesn't know or interpret anything. Now, remember we talked about in class, we touched upon, what do you call that? Reflexes. And typically, once you have a sensory receptor that picks up something, it sends it all the way up into the central nervous system via the spinal cord, and then it goes to the brain, and then the brain processes it, and then tells the motor to go do something or go effect a change to the homeostasis condition that you want to change. Well, this interneuron that's in your spinal cord shortcuts all of that. Because instead of going all the way up to the brain, right, interneuron is a quick path in between your sensory and your motor. And that's why when you have like something like a reflex, like, have you ever like cooked some fries or some maybe fried chicken, right? Which I really would like right now. I'm hungry. So I'm cooking fried chicken. The oil splatters. I feel the oil splattering, but I don't feel the heat. Do you ever notice that you pull your hand and get away from the oil or the pan even before you feel the pain of the heat? Well, that's your interneuron at play. That's your reflexes at play. And when we do reflexes like hit your patellar tendon, you know, your kneecap, the tendon underneath your kneecap, I sense it. It goes through the interneuron in my spinal cord, and then I kick my foot or kick my leg. My brain doesn't have, but my brain gets involved like milliseconds later to acknowledge, hey, the doctor hit my knee, right? So when we're checking reflexes, we're checking the peripheral nervous system, we're checking the spinal cord, and we're checking your muscular or your motor neuron, right? Motor neuron, of course, is a nerve cell that connects to your effector, which is most likely a muscle. So we're checking all of that, but when we do reflexes, it has nothing to do with the brain, okay? Neuroglia, remember they were the support staff? Okay, that's all you need to know. They nourish the neuron. They remove its garbage, right? That's it. They're also a glue. They hold neurons in place, but what they don't do is send the message. So neuroglia, think support cells for the neuron. The neuron or the nerve cell, that's the star. Here are some neuroglia, and let's see what they do, okay? So remember you have an artery, vein, and nerve? Well, astrocytes connect you to that, right? They bring in substances for the brain and then take substances out. We already know the oligodendrocytes in your central nervous system make myelin. Microglia, they're phagocytic cells, hence they are immune cells. Ependymal cells are your ependyma, potato, right? They help regulate the composition of CSF or cerebrospinal fluid. I'm going to talk more about cerebrospinal fluid in a minute. So think astrocytes connect neurons to blood cells and blood vessels. So, you know, it has something to do with, you know, giving it oxygen, taking out the carbon dioxide, giving it nutrients, and taking out the garbage. Oligodendrocytes, think what? Myelin. Only in the central nervous system, but in the peripheral nervous system, it's Schwann cells. Microglia, think like macrophage, they're phagocytic, and they immune. And ependymal cells, think regulation of your cerebral spinal fluid. And here's what it looks like. So you got the star, the neuron, but then you have the oligodendrocyte that's making and semi-repairing the myelin sheath. Microglial cells, they'll eat up any bacteria or virus that may threaten this neuron. Astrocyte, you see how it connects the neuron, and it could feed it oxygen, and then it can remove its carbon dioxide, feed it some nutrients, move ions in and out, okay? And ependymal cell, I want you to think fluid, right? CSF, cerebral spinal fluid. So this is a nice summary picture you could use. Let's see what's important. Neuron regeneration. Now, for our purposes, nerves don't grow back. Okay? So we're not going to entertain this. Once you cut them, once you damage them, they don't grow back. But what they do is, like let's say you had a stroke or some damage, your brain and the other nervous parts of your nervous system can rewire things. So you can be rewired and trained to do something else. And that's why physical therapy is very, very important in not only physical and injuries, but every other injury to get you back on track neurologically. Ion channels, we talked about, they open and close. You have your bilipid layer. We already know about this. Now, saltatory conduction, I mentioned that earlier. The action potential doesn't have to go in a straight, like it goes in a straight line, but it doesn't have to go through the entire wire. It can do what? Boop, boop, boop. See how it jumps to here, jumps to there, jumps to there. It's much, much faster. That's all that saltatory conduction is. It makes it go faster. And it makes it happen for two things. You have this myelin sheath, and of course, the exposure of the axon in these little nodes called nodes of Ranvier. And you see this plus and minuses? That's all that electricity is. It's the movement of ions, pluses and minuses. Just real quick, the movement of pluses and ions, just so you can understand and have a better understanding of that. Take a 9-volt battery, right? You know that little square battery that you put in your smoke detectors? Put your tongue on one of either the plus or minus. You don't feel anything, right? Put your tongue on just the minus. You don't feel anything. But put your tongue on both the plus and minus, what do you feel? Zap. And that's what this is. That's what electricity is. It's just the transfer of positive or cations and negative anions, and the movement of that creates electricity. Now, what's the synapse? We already talked about the synapse, okay? So let's look at the picture. This is the synapse, the space, also known as the synaptic cleft or the synaptic gap. Through that synaptic cleft and synaptic gap run neurotransmitters. We already know 2 neurotransmitters. One neurotransmitter for skeletal muscles, which is acetylcholine, and 2 neurotransmitters for smooth muscle, also known as visceral muscle, that's acetylcholine and norepinephrine. And you could see calcium is also involved. So think calcium catalyst, thing that starts it. And we already talked about calcium in heart muscle, in their T-tubules, and we already talked about calcium in striated muscle in their sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay? Now, there are some neurotransmitters that are excitatory. Another excitatory ion, we already now know one excitatory ion is calcium. Well, another one is sodium. And there are inhibitory neurotransmitters, and we mentioned one of them as potassium, or K+. So you have excitatory ones and inhibitory ones. Excitatory, think sodium, potassium. Inhibitory, think what? Potassium, also chlorine or chloride. That's why, I think this is how I remember inhibitory. What do you think we give people on death row when we're going to execute them? I'm going to make their heart stop permanently. And how do I do that? Potassium iodide. I tell the synapse, hey, shut down permanently. We already know acetylcholine. Neural pools, each pool, nice to know, yeah. Convergence, divergence, nice to know. There are more relevant things in this chapter than convergence and divergence. That's all it means, right? Just connections. All right, oh, that's the end of it. So, that's part 1. We have more stuff to do, but if you got any questions, of course, always email me. I answer my stuff relatively between 12 to 24 hours, even on the weekends. So thank you, everybody, and for putting up with me yapping. I'll see you in class.